Introducing the High Middle Ages. Wait, how did St. Francis get here? I mean, introducing the real High Middle Ages. And no, I'm not referring to St. Francis this time. This is that time period from roughly the 11th century to 15th century CE when we emerge from the Dark Ages. Now, if you think about what we associate with the Roman Empire, trade, communication, cities, secure trade, having protected borders, etc. The Dark Ages is about all of that stuff going away. The High Middle Ages is about some of that stuff creeping back. So, quick summary of some of the stuff we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the fact that we have cities again, and you start to see a decline in manorialism, even though most peasants are still farming. You also see increased social mobility. If you remember, this is that idea that just because you're born in a social class doesn't mean you have to spend your entire life there. You see increased trade with Asia because of trade routes and because of the Crusades. You start to see increased activity in the economy caused by, in part, banking. I don't like the idea of increased universities because that presupposes that there were universities like during the Dark Ages. Basically, in the High Middle Ages, we get universities. You start to see a declining feudal political structure, and monarchies emerge that are more centralized. And you start to see the monarchies like those of England and France strengthen themselves as a consequence of the Hundred Years' War. Some new technologies that debut in sort of the 13 and 1400s assist in the centralization of monarchies, specifically cannons. So by about the year 1000, we begin to see a return to city life. And remember, during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the population of cities basically, they plummet across the board. But with cities, remember, we get basically specialization of labor. And so you get growing economies, growing marketplaces. And along with that, because things are beginning to get so specialized, you see a growing demand for literacy. If you're basically just growing food in a barter system, the only thing you need to keep track of is you need a couple of people to keep track of, how much food has been produced, how much food has been consumed, and how much food can you really trade for other goods. You don't really need much literacy. I didn't say that literacy isn't desired in its own right, but in terms of just, the meat and potatoes of literacy, remember, literacy probably first develops in order to keep track of, agricultural yield. So there's not the same pressure to develop literacy or embrace literacy in the manorial system. But once you get people in cities, suddenly the demand for literacy, partially just to keep things like account books, that sort of thing, it begins to increase. Also, the fact that you don't have Vikings raiding your home or church every other week kind of helps matters too. So for the most part, any education that you would find anywhere in Europe was going to be found in the church. You even see this in the Carolingian Renaissance, where it's mostly church schools that are providing basic education. Charlemagne's chief advisor is this guy by the name of Alcuin of York, and he is a clergyman. He is part of the Catholic Church. So again, any of your intellectuals, any of your scholars are going to probably be associated with the church in some way, shape, or form. So around the year 1000, you get cathedral schools that are designed to train people to be future members of the clergy. But then starting at around the 13th century, you actually see the development of advanced universities. And really there are three possible progressions there. So you've got theology, which is kind of the obvious one, but you also have progressions in studies in medicine and law. This is back in the good old days where you don't have to go to school like for 3, 4, 8 extra years after undergraduate school in order to get, your doctoral degree. So, and by the way, note that we're only looking at a few places here. Really, university life specifically develops in Italy, in universities like in Bologna and Pisa. They gradually spread outward. Note that you have universities in Salamanca, Toulouse, Paris, Cambridge and Oxford eventually. But we're not talking about a huge number of places. Also, just so you know, the entire, we preserve a lot of the medieval roots of our educational system. So when we graduate, for example, note that we wear sort of these long flowing robes like they would wear in the Middle Ages. If you get a master's or doctoral degree, you might have to, or you might choose to wear a medieval cowl. Like all of these things and traditions actually have their roots in the Middle Ages. These university centers are going to create economic and cultural vitality. They're going to stimulate the market, but we also have to note that this is a complicated relationship because where you see those universities are mostly like in places along the Italian peninsula, and these are locations where the Crusades actually have the most direct economic impact. So goods that are flowing from Western Asia are going, not exclusively, but in large part to cities like Genoa, Venice, those types of cities. And so where you see the economic impact of the Crusades, you also tend to see the emergence of universities. Also, with the Crusades, you're bringing home texts in Greek and Arabic, etc. And so it's not all that surprising that you see the emergence of universities in reaction to that. Of course, the re-embrace of these Greco-Roman texts that are coming in from the Middle East, they kind of ignite a debate. Remember, like going back to St. Paul, Christianity has always had this really weird relationship with Greek and Roman learning specifically. So we talked about how the Apostle Paul's, conception of Christianity is influenced by Greek philosophy. It's argued that those Greek philosophical influences transitions Christianity from a religion practiced by Jewish people into a world religion. So on the one hand, Greek philosophy is in the foundation of Christianity, but also, Greek philosophy is not explicitly Christian. There are some ideas from some Greek philosophers that might be congruent with Christian ideas, but that's certainly not the case for all of Greek philosophy. Also, if you look at the job of many Christian monks in monasteries, a lot of what they're doing is they are preserving and translating these old Greco-Roman texts. So we just see this very, very awkward relationship between Roman and Greek learning and Christianity. And are they reconcilable? That's kind of the debate that emerges in the 12 and 1300s. So you have some individuals, like this monk, Bernard of Clairvaux, I think. I'm not a French linguist, so sorry. Bernard of Clairvaux basically argues that you can't really integrate these two things together. That if you try to logic your way and use Greek philosophy to understanding God, then that kind of defeats the purpose of faith, which is the very foundation of Christianity. And by the way, this is not something that is a view that's unique to Bernard of Clairvaux. We emphasize some of the superficial differences between Orthodox Christianity and Catholic Christianity, but the reality is that Orthodox Christianity has long embraced the idea that God is fundamentally unknowable, that God is on another plane of existence. You can't really logically explain God, and to do so kind of defeats the point. But in the medieval world, you actually see a generation of scholars led by individuals like Thomas Aquinas, Peter Abelard, Albertus Magnus, which is maybe the coolest name ever. They think that Greek philosophy is the key to understanding Christianity. Specifically, using Aristotelian reasoning, in other words, if you remember us talking about Aristotle's logic, using logic as presented by Aristotle is what is going to help us fundamentally understand the nature of God and the cosmos. So the idea is that essentially God is a part of this universe that he creates. And because this universe that he creates is logical, then therefore logic is the tool that's going to be used to understand the nature of God. Thomas Aquinas, seen here with what is, I guess, a forehead soul patch. Thomas Aquinas has a very famous quote that I'm going to paraphrase here. And he says something like, even God, when he creates triangles, has to create a triangle that where the sum of all its angles adds up to 180 degrees. Now think about that. Like, okay, it seems like that Thomas Aquinas is just being a geometry nerd and is just really into triangles. And by the way, in the Middle Ages, people really were into triangles. But there's a lot of depth to that statement. This is the creator of the universe. This is theoretically the person that made the laws of nature. Could not he also break those laws? And if you're Thomas Aquinas, the answer is no. And that these laws can also be used to understand the cosmos itself. So scholasticism is the idea that you can use logic to resolve theological issues and just issues in general. It's also basically what Aquinas does is he synthesizes Christianity and Aristotle together. Remember, Aristotle believed in the idea of a God, but it's a God who was the unmoved mover, just a God to explain why the universe came into existence. So Aquinas applies logical reasoning to the entirety of the Christian Bible. So now we're going to move into religion in art and literature. The TLDR here is that pretty much anything that is creative in Europe during the Middle Ages almost always has some kind of religious connection. In fact, one of the things that makes the Renaissance is this idea that not everything that you do that you create has to be religious. So if we're looking at architecture, for example, like the structures that were on the cutting edge in terms of introducing new architectural styles and debuting art and skill were, of course, these churches. So we generally divide them into two architectural styles, Romanesque and Gothic. And by the way, I'll let you take a guess as to why we call it Romanesque. If you guess that it is, it's because it resembles Roman-style architecture, you would be correct. You can especially tell right here where you have these big blocky arches. So that's kind of the early form of architecture that was pretty common during the Dark Ages, all the way up to the introduction of Gothic architecture in the 10th century or in the 11th century. And if you've ever been inside a Romanesque church, also take a note of, how small these windows are. They're very dark and sort of cloistered. Once you get Gothic architecture, here's what I want you to think. How tall can we make this puppy? Because everything in Gothic architecture seems to be about these tall and elaborate spires that seem impossible in some respects, impossible for them to stand on their own. So you get these big flying buttresses here that are designed to basically support these very, very tall spires, and notice how jagged and angular everything is getting here. Now, if you go into one of these Gothic cathedrals, usually there are very large stained glass windows, you have these high ceilings, and often, this is kind of hard to see here, but these cathedrals were shaped like a cross. And the effect was to basically give people an idea or a sampling of what heaven looked like, even though it's on earth. What's absolutely bonkers to think about, though, is that these cathedrals could be multi-generational construction projects. I'd be interested to know how many medieval families had a grandparent, parent, and child all work on a cathedral for basically a good chunk of, if not their entire lives. Cathedral construction was absolutely enormous, and of course, it probably didn't help matters that you had a shortage of specialized labor during this time period. So moving on to literature, just like the Abbasids, where you have the sort of language of art and the nobility, the court, which is like Persian, and then you have Arabic for mostly everything else. In the Middle Ages, you basically have Latin as the language of your intellectual class, it's the language of law, of education, but then you have vernacular for most everything else. Vernacular, in case you don't know, is basically using the everyday language. So in England, the language of the educated would be Latin, the vernacular would be English. So you see the emergence of what we call secular literature, along with literature being in the language of the local population. Few examples of this include the Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, the Divine Comedy, and I'll also throw up Boccaccio's The Decameron here. I don't know that I would necessarily agree that it's secular literature, because the Divine Comedy, for instance, there's very little that is secular about it. But you do have, like, the Canterbury Tales involves Christian pilgrims, but it's really, a very comedic story about medieval travel. Like, religion is not the focal point. And with Beowulf, that's not a religious story really whatsoever. The Divine Comedy, that is more explicitly religious. I've heard it being described as basically Christian fan fiction. It is the story of, among other things, the narrator Dante Alighieri looking for his long-lost love. And in so doing, he has to go through hell, which is told in the Inferno, purgatory, as told in Purgatorio, and heaven, told in Paradiso. Most people sort of forget the latter two books and focus on hell. So what's interesting about hell, Dante's version of hell, is that hell is divided into 7 different circles, and basically you find yourself in a circle associated with a type of sin that you committed the most during your life. So like gluttony, lust, greed, etc. And then in the 7th circle of hell, you have basically Satan, who is eternally consuming the 3 traitors of history, Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius. Now, note Brutus and Cassius. These are the 2 individuals who helped assassinate and organize the assassination of Julius Caesar. Other classical references include the fact that Dante is led through hell by this Roman poet by the name of Virgil. He was basically Caesar Augustus's favorite poet. Also, in the 1st circle of hell, you have this sort of enclave, this redoubt, which is brightly lit, and Virgil tells Dante that that is an area reserved for noble pagans like Socrates and Plato, for example, who weren't Christian but had the light of reason. So it's this idea. It kind of almost shows that awkward relationship the church has always had with Greco-Roman thinking. So you're going to see more of this when we get into the Renaissance. Okay, we get a number of agricultural innovations during the High Middle Ages. One, we get better tools for peasants to use to farm, including moldboard, which is basically this curved iron plate, which allows deeper turning of heavy soil, which means that seeds are more likely to sprout. You also have a solution to a problem that sort of existed for a very long time, which is what happens if you overfarm. And that's where you get the idea of crop rotation, where you leave half of land uncultivated so that the soil can basically replenish itself of nitrogen. So this obviously helps the soil regenerate, but it does kind of limit productivity, which makes for pretty unhappy nobles. So you also have this other system called the three-field system, where basically you let 1/3 of your plot recover, while the 2/3 are used to grow different kinds of crops. And so you see a variety of different agricultural improvements. So we see an increase in production. This is partially because of, an increased population, so you have more workers. Because of the fact that now we have marketplaces in cities, there's now more of a reason to be productive, because around this time period, the idea is that you need to be productive to keep your lord happy, but also feed your family. There's really not much of an incentive beyond that. But now, theoretically, you have manors with the ability to sell the excess. So the other thing that's happening is that there's this little sort of ice age that overlaps with the Dark Ages. Now you see basically the increase of global temperatures, and that also helps with agricultural productivity. Now, some peasants eventually gain some level of financial freedom and are able to basically go and get their own land. This doesn't make them lords, but it doesn't make them ordinary peasants either. Some actually move into the cities and basically join this growing middle class. Speaking of which, you see the emergence of money again. We are doing away with the barter system that we associate with manorialism, and now we begin to see banking and things like insurance emerge. We talked about the significance of banking to the financial system, that basically if you don't have banking, it means that basically the economy is moving at a snail's pace. So we start to see the emergence of actual banks, and we also see the emergence of two incredibly wealthy cities, Venice and Genoa. These are cities that most directly benefited from the Crusades and the sort of transporting of Greek and Roman learning across the Mediterranean. Now, there are other sort of trade zones in Europe, and marketplaces where you see the development of specific products. So, for example, in England, you had large quantities of wool that was often taken to the Netherlands to basically weave into cloth. France was renowned for their wine and cheese. Of course, that doesn't ever change. And Scandinavia for timber, fish, and fur. In the Wild West of Europe, otherwise known as Germany, what's interesting is that northern Germany, or Germany just in general, is very feudalistic. The government is not very centralized. And in North Germany especially, you see cities like Hamburg and also cities along the Rhine River that are very mercantile, where there's not this strong local government. And you also see the emergence of these almost merchant cities. And so we get what's called the Hanseatic League. This is basically an organization of merchant guilds and cities that work together for economic benefit. So it gives them considerable power in trading because you don't have the same limitations on the middle class, on merchants, like you have in the stronger monarchies like England and France. Now, this was a real challenge for feudalism because, of course, merchants, just like in ancient China, have fairly low social status. But now, starting with urbanization, starting with the emergence of trade, merchants can live lives as indulgent and as, well, wealthy as those of knights and aristocrats. In some cases, these merchants become much wealthier. And so you see these concerns about capitalism and greed. Some of it is coming from the peasants, admittedly. Some of it is coming from basically the older rich people, like the nobles, who are concerned about the erosion of their power and influence because of how influential merchants are becoming. With this theme of the increase in power and influence of the lower classes, we also see the beginnings of the merchant guilds. These are especially common in Italy. You notice that in Italy, you start to see the debut of a lot of different things, universities, the reintroduction of Greco-Roman learning, and also finally, guilds. So guilds are basically these, in some respects, they're like labor unions. In other respects, they kind of act almost like corporations. But basically, these are groups within cities that represent a particular trade. So the idea is that if you were a part of this guild, you would not only be apprenticed to somebody who was much more senior and much more experienced, that kind of thing, but that eventually you would sort of work your way through the system and be acknowledged as some kind of like master. So this was very common among professions that we would consider sort of middle class professions: sculptors, artists, blacksmiths, that kind of thing. And because you have all people controlling, or you have this organization that basically controls all the labor in a certain profession, it basically means that you can set prices to whatever you really want. So in some respects, it's kind of monopolistic. But on the other hand, it means that you begin to see things like quality control. Through the regulation of apprentices, through the creation of, standards in certain professions. So in some respects, you're starting to see something that we're going to see more of as the Middle Ages comes to a close, which is professionalization. In other words, you begin to see people in jobs, and they're not there as like a side gig. They're there because that's what they do for like their entire life. So now, or at least next time, we will move on to the culture of the Middle Ages. And just as a reminder, you can't spell the word culture without spelling the word cult. So till next time.